Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou e te ihi, tēnā koutou e te wihi, tēnā koutou e te wana, tēnā koutou e te mana, tēnā koutou e te tapu. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, everybody, and welcome to our session today. So I'm Denise Cosgrove. I'm the Chief Executive of Presbyterian Support Northern. And I'm really excited to host this inaugural lecture series on child wellbeing. And we'll be doing it over a 4-month period. So we're consciously enabling series of small audiences, bringing interested public, private, and not-for-profit people together. We've got 9 now keynote speakers, and there's been a range of complex social policy topics, because we want to encourage debate, discussion, and hopefully provoke some collaborative action on ways to impactfully shift the outcomes for our tamariki, our children in New Zealand. We know that this is also a defining focus for our new government and our Prime Minister. But they are issues that are dear to us at PSN. Our vision is about a better life for everyone, and our key goal is to build the capacity of children and their families in whānau through our suite of services. So you'll know of those. So we have Family Works, Shine, Lifeline, and Enliven. And we want to take a leadership role outside of government to start building that capacity at the community, sector and system levels. So this series is just one way that we're trying to do that. It's giving us and you access to leading thinkers and commentators, novel practices and efficacious solutions. And we know that the issues are complex, they're multifaceted, and they need a cross-sectoral integrated approach, which is why we really want to support a national conversation. So today, we're really delighted to have Michael Reddell here. Now, his topic is possibilities in passion, or lack thereof, lifting productivity for our kids' sake. So Michael is a thought provoker. He's independent. He's not afraid to challenge. In fact, I think you've probably taken a lot of flack in your life, but you have a greater goal, and that is about the well-being of our community, our society, our people. Michael has a very deep history and experience in economics and policy and advice, including a stint in Papua New Guinea and one in Zambia, but spent a lot of time at the Reserve Bank. But now you do some really interesting things. So I was talking to some people before saying, go and have a look at your Croaking Cassandra blog, which is really interesting. And some of you might have heard Michael just as recently. It was replayed last night, I think, on Radio New Zealand, around topics around this and immigration and other things. So we're also interested in your thoughts today. It's the budget, so this afternoon. So any comments on that? So with that, I'm going to pass over to Michael, and then we'll come back and do the question and answers. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Denise, and I'd just like to thank Presbyterian Support Northern for organising this series and inviting me to be a part of it. There's a whole lot of things I'm not going to be talking about today. I'm not talking about the Child Poverty Reduction Bill, other specific child-focused measures. I'm not going to be talking about inequality, the welfare system or culture. I'm going to be focusing on the one thing that these guys have asked me to talk about, and that's productivity and the possibilities that doing so much better would open up for us and for our kids. My focus also isn't on specific policy ideas for how to lift average productivity in New Zealand. We can touch on that in the questions if you want. Instead, this is really a plea to our politicians and our officials to recover the belief and start acting as if they believe it, that New Zealand can do a whole lot better on this score, because it can. I'd like you to imagine a country in which the average age at death is only about 45. 6% of kids die before their first birthday. Another 1.5% die before they turn 5. Not many children are vaccinated. Most kids in this country get to primary school, but only a minority attend secondary school. By 15, not more than 15% or so are still at school. Only a handful do any post-secondary education. And houses are typically small. There's not much dedicated space for doing homework or anything of the sort, even though families are bigger than ones we're used to. Perhaps 1 in 10 households in this country has a telephone. And there's street lights in the central city, but most people don't have electricity at home. Tuberculosis in this country is a significant risk, 7% of all deaths. Coal fires are the main means of heating and fuel for cooking, and that means the air quality in cities is pretty dreadful, perhaps especially on still winter days. Deaths from bronchitis far exceed what we now see in advanced countries. Of course, there isn't much traffic-related pollution. There's few cars, so mostly people walk or take the tram. The biggest city is finally about to get a proper sewage system, but most people outside the cities have nothing of the sort. And washing clothes is largely done by hand. Imagine coping with those larger families. In this country, maternal mortality rates have fallen a lot, but they're still 10 times those we see in 2018 in advanced countries. 1 in every 50 female deaths is from childbirth-related conditions, which leaves some kids without mothers right from the start. Welfare assistance is pretty patchy. Most people don't live long enough to be eligible for a means-tested age pension. Orphans aren't in a great position. There's nothing systematic for those who are seriously disabled. There's a semi-public hospital system, but most medical costs fall on the individuals and their families, and there just isn't much that can be done about many conditions. There are public holidays and school holidays, but no annual leave entitlements. No doubt the comfortably off do take the occasional holiday away from home, but most don't because they can't. They can't afford it. Only recently has a rail route between the 2 largest cities been opened up, but it takes 20 hours for cities that are only 400 miles apart. I wouldn't choose to live in that country, would you? And yet my grandparents did live there. They were all kids then, because that was New Zealand 100 years ago, just prior to World War I. I took most of that data from the 1913 New Zealand Official Yearbook. And if it sounds pretty bleak, remember that New Zealand was probably the wealthiest place with the best material living standards of any country on earth. In the decade leading up to World War I, New Zealand's per capita income was on average the highest in the world. We jostled with the United States and Australia. The UK was just a bit behind. The historical GDP estimates are inevitably a bit imprecise. But if you look through that 1913 official yearbook, statistic after statistic that the compilers had available for showed up New Zealand better than the other rich countries. Life expectancy is a pretty good indicator. Matt Ridley's recent book, The Rational Optimist, records that in 1920, New Zealand had the highest life expectancy of any country in the world. This was an era when prominent visitors came from Europe and the Americas to check out all that New Zealand had accomplished. Some went away and wrote books about what we'd achieved. But remember those atrocious statistics. By our standards, life in 1913 New Zealand, whether for children or adults, left a huge amount to be desired. On some metrics, things were worse then than they are in poor countries today. 4% of Papua New Guinean babies now die before their first birthday, but that's less than the rate in New Zealand when we were the richest and most productive country in the world. Our real incomes today are about 4 times what our forebears enjoyed on the eve of World War I. Things had already come a huge way by 1913. New Zealand really was, by the standards of the day, the land of milk and honey. But by today's standards, my grandparents, who were kids in 1913 middle-class families, were poor. The huge difference, the thing that really makes things different, is productivity, and that's my theme today. Now, productivity, just to clear this away, isn't usually just about working harder. On average, New Zealanders today work less hard in the market or around the house than our ancestors 100 years ago did. Most adults then were working by 14 and dead by 65. What productivity means is it's about possibilities, and many more of them. Growth and productivity involves businesses, whether new or old, finding new markets, finding better stuff to make, better ways of making existing stuff. That's what made those better material outcomes possible. Things are better not because we redistributed the cake. There were benefits in doing that at every specific point in time, but because we found ways collectively and individually to make the cake a whole lot bigger. 100 years from now, our descendants, and those are the kids that we worry about today, are likely to be much better off materially than we are now. Some people believe that productivity can't go on forever. Productivity growth can't go on forever, and maybe they're right, but there isn't any particular reason to suppose that that will occur this century. Apart from anything else, so many more people are now getting an education and access to the opportunities that add to the leading edge of innovation, new ideas. Just think of China and India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and even these days emerging Africa. If the world could sustain productivity growth of just 1% per annum, it's hard to even measure reliably on an annual basis. All else equal, potential material living standards 100 years from now would be almost 3 times what we have today. If we could manage 1.5% annual productivity growth, and that's a benchmark we often use when I was a public sector economist, we'd have incomes 4.5 times current levels in 100 years' time, with all the possibilities, the opportunities that that brings. Now, sometimes it's hard to conceptualise in our minds what these future numbers might mean. New Zealand incomes today are 4.5 times those in lower middle income countries like Guatemala, the Philippines or Morocco. Now, that isn't a perfect comparison. No doubt many teens in Guatemala also have smartphones, but it gives us a bit of a sense of what a difference productivity, or the lack of it, makes. Material living standards, opportunities for our kids are so much better in New Zealand than in any of those countries that I've listed. But again, my focus today isn't on this almost impossible to conceive distant future, but on what we can do, what can be done with today's technologies and today's ideas. In much of the discussion so far, I've proceeded as if New Zealand was near what economists call the frontier. It's not a physical frontier, the Wild West or Central North Island bush, but rather the economic frontier, the best economic results anyone's managing anywhere. At the frontier, you can't just, as a whole society, get richer by copying or adapting someone else's ideas. You have to break the path yourself, constantly having to find new and smarter ways to do things. New Zealand was there, or thereabouts, in 1913. We had some world-leading technologies in dairy and refrigerated shipping, and abundant land relative to the small number of people. But that was then. These days, New Zealand's miles off the pace. The most widely used statistical measure of productivity is what we call real gross domestic product per hour worked. And the best cross-country comparisons, and these things are inevitably imprecise, suggest that there's a group of countries who mark out the frontier. They have real GDP per hour worked of around $70 an hour. And they're Belgium, the United States, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark and France. There's both large and small countries in that group. Country size really isn't an issue here. There are some other countries on either side of that. Norway's quite a bit better off, but they have huge amounts of oil and gas, and not many people. And behind them, Singapore's coming up just behind the top tier group. Its GDP per hour worked is roughly similar to that in Sweden and Switzerland. What about New Zealand? Well, New Zealand, unfortunately, is only about 30th on the list. The top tier of countries has output per hour of $70. In equivalent terms, our number is $42 an hour. As best we can measure things, we manage to produce only 60% as much for each hour we put in as those top Northern European and American countries. And remember, this isn't about wages, this is about the total value of all that's produced, the value added in our economy. Let those numbers sink in, though, for a moment. What they mean is that it would take a 2/3 increase in the level of productivity in New Zealand to catch those countries. Our real GDP per hour worked has increased by about 2/3 since the early 70s. So it's almost as if we're 45 years off the pace. Our nearest neighbour, Australia, has also fallen off the pace to some extent, but it would still take a 40% increase for New Zealand to catch up with average productivity in Australia. We just haven't been finding as many smart things to profitably do here as people in those other countries have. In part, in New Zealand, we make up for those bad productivity numbers by working longer hours than most countries do. And that includes more people working later in life. But that isn't or shouldn't be much consolation. Plenty of people enjoy their work, but most do it largely for the income. And time is the ultimate scarce factor in our lives. Time spent working is time not doing other stuff, including spending time with the kids or the grandkids. Now, there are plenty of places that are worse than us. Productivity in New Zealand, for example, is about 3 times that of China. But if we look at how far from the frontier, those top-tier countries that we are, and remember that we were at that frontier ourselves, not much beyond living memory, we can see just how large the catch-up possibilities are, what we could be. 50 years ago, Singapore was as far behind France and Germany as we are behind those countries now. Singapore's almost caught up. There's no obvious reason why we couldn't do the same. Places like Belgium, France, Netherlands. There's a lot of differences across those top 6 countries. But the key point is that they all now do so much better than we do. And since the focus of this series is on children, that means that all of those very different countries, each with their own problems, have many more resources to meet the needs and aspirations of children and their families and of everyone else. And their people don't even need to work as long as we do to get hold of those resources and those opportunities. Now, some of you might be drumming your fingers at this point impatiently, thinking that this is pie-in-the-sky economist stuff. Well, if so, I'd say you're mostly wrong. Of course, you're right that if we just focus on economy-wide productivity beginning today, that doesn't help the struggling family, the vulnerable child today. Then again, if we'd successfully tackled these issues 10 or 20 years ago, it would have made a huge difference to today's kids. And nothing that policy can do today to redistribute, to cut the cake differently, will make anything like the difference to the economic possibilities that a couple of decades of strong productivity growth would have made. That's the whole point of those contrasts between 1913 and now. It's productivity that makes the difference, that transforms the material possibilities for society. Now, I'm not making an argument for doing nothing now. If we'd known in 1913 what living standards would be like today, that wouldn't have been a reason to do nothing specific child-focused then. After all, each child is an individual. Each of us is a child only once. But equally, no child-focused policies adopted in 1913 could have given kids and families 2018 material living standards then. Productivity growth is what made it possible. It's also worth bearing in mind two things about even the best designed redistributive policies. First, they typically leave the economy a bit smaller than it otherwise would be. Those are the deadweight costs of taxation you sometimes hear economists talking about. What you tax, you get less of. And second, I just want to make a bit of this. Often enough, even the worthwhile redistributions that we do are largely attempting to make up for the costs that we've imposed on poor people and their kids through other regulatory impositions. Why are far more kids in cold, damp or overcrowded houses, rented homes at that, than we like or think proper? Much of it's because of the choices of successive governments to make urban land artificially scarce. That's given us some of the most expensive house and urban land prices relative to income anywhere in the world, and particularly here in Auckland. Boise, Idaho was the fastest growing city in the US last year. It's a picturesque city set in the mountains. You can buy a median house there for $250,000. That's less than 400,000 New Zealand dollars. Household incomes in Boise are higher than those here. And plenty of significant growing US cities are even cheaper than Boise. Now, anyone here working at the coalface, dealing with struggling individual families today, will know that housing is one of the more important immediate challenges for many. Fixing that at source, which is technically easy but if politically challenging, could make a more immediate material difference for our country's struggling children than almost anything else governments can fix. Our hosts, PSN, have an explicitly moral dimension to their vision. And against that backdrop, in this forum, I don't think it's going too far to call current housing and land policy evil, in effect, if not in intent. It relentlessly redistributes from the poorer, the younger, the more marginal parts of our society, and those are precisely the groups where most of the severely materially disadvantaged kids are found. But disgraceful as the housing situation is, that isn't my focus. It's productivity. Economists famously talk about there being no such thing as a free lunch. But lifting productivity is the closest thing there is. Because what productivity is achieving more with what we've got. The people, the skills, the natural resources. And what it means is there's more to go around and more potentially to go around for everyone. Unfortunately, it seems to me the New Zealand debate has increasingly lost sight of that. In my view, it isn't helped by the near-exclusive focus on relative poverty measures. Andrew Lee did the first lecture in this series, and in it he noted more or less in passing that the child poverty rates in New Zealand and Australia were about the same, around 14%. But of course, those are relative productivity measures, largely defined relative to the median income in each country. But productivity, GDP per hour worked in Australia, is almost 40% higher than that in New Zealand. And that means, at least to a first approximation, that a child defined as living in poverty in Australia is likely to be around 40% materially better off than such a child in New Zealand. And those gaps are getting larger, not smaller. As you know, in the last 5 years here, child poverty and related issues have had a whole new level of visibility and a political salience. There was lots of debate around these issues in last year's election campaign. But as far as I could see, almost nothing on the thing that would really make a big long-term difference. So you heard a bit about productivity from both main parties. National tried to tell you that we had one of the best performing economies in the advanced world. Labor pointed out from time to time that it wasn't, but they never offered a joined-up plan that could credibly be argued to make such a difference. And not once did I hear any political figure make the straightforward point that lifting productivity, even just getting halfway to Denmark, Belgium or France, would radically transform the outlook for all New Zealanders, children or not. Or that without fixing the productivity problem, there'll only ever be so much that any government can do to patch up the current symptoms and to lift the living standards of our kids. Of course, from time to time, governments affect to care for a while, and perhaps some individual members even do. As one example of this care for a while, a decade ago, the then new government unenthusiastically signed on to a goal of catching up with Australia by 2025. There was even a government task force set up to look at it. I was a Treasury official at the time and I helped them with their report. Their first report had been officially and publicly discarded, literally binned, by the Prime Minister before it was even released. The task force itself was wound up and not another word was heard of the goal. And it wasn't as if the government said, oops, we just got the wrong advisors, we need better, deeper analysis from other people. Or as if the opposition said, isn't it disgraceful the government simply abandoned the goal? But we care about our kids, all our kids. We're going to pour our energies and resources into getting to the bottom of this issue and to campaign on an aggressive plan to get New Zealand back to where it deserves to be. Instead, the goal just disappeared. It's not, I think, much different now. In fact, I noticed Amy Adams has a piece on Stuff this morning, a pre-budget piece, talking about economic issues and challenges. The word productivity, the idea doesn't appear at all. I'll be surprised if it appears much in the budget this afternoon. Australia and comparisons with Australia matter for New Zealand for a number of reasons. First, of course, Australia is another resource-dependent country, Anglo-based institutions, far from anywhere. But it's also the exit option that almost everyone who's a New Zealand citizen has open to them. That's been great for the individual New Zealanders who've gone. Take a 3-hour flight to a fairly similar culture, and average wages are perhaps 40% higher than they are here. And of course, house prices in Sydney and Melbourne are about as ruinous as those here. For many, that move has substantially lifted material well-being for themselves and for their kids. But that option comes at a price. It means we've had a net loss of almost 1 million New Zealanders in my lifetime, almost 800,000 just since 1980. It's certainly one solution for individuals, but it's a pretty unattractive one relative to fixing the problem at source. It means kids detached from cousins and grandparents, kids detached from their own national heritage. And while that mightn't seem as serious as a cold, damp house, the two shouldn't be, and they don't need to be alternatives. And I suspect we underestimate the longer-term importance of a shared commitment to a common national project at our peril. By the way, don't be deceived by the current temporarily small outflow to Australia. In part, that's about the fact that unemployment's been a bit higher in Australia recently, perhaps a bit about a growing recognition of the guest worker status of many New Zealand immigrants to Australia. On current policies, the big outflows will either resume again, which would be a mixed blessing, as I said, or we'll be left with an economy that's still underperforming, but in which people no longer perceive a viable exit option. But despite all this, at a political level, all we seem to get is things like gotcha parliamentary questions, where one side or the other attempts to find a statistic or a time frame in which we might have done a bit better or a bit worse, according to interest, than Australia. But there's no serious analysis of the issues going on. There's no burning passion, whether for the sake of our kids or just not to be beaten by the Aussies, to make a real and sustained difference. Of course, it's easy to call for this, it's harder to do, especially when it might mean persevering for decades. There's a line apparently from Nietzsche, although I first found it in a book by a Presbyterian minister, about a long obedience in the same direction being the way in which fundamental change happens. We can't wave a wand and again be quickly as wealthy or as productive as the countries at the Northern European frontier or even Australia. But even if we get the preconditions right, we'd need to stick to them. But it isn't as if the end point is the only game, that we failed if we haven't matched Belgium, France or the US. We're not chasing a single pot of gold. Every year that we record faster productivity growth, we give ourselves and our kids and our needy and vulnerable options that we don't have today. Each year that we grow faster than those top-tier countries, we'd be making inroads. Just to illustrate the point, I did a little scenario. Suppose those top-tier countries achieve productivity growth of 1% per annum, and we managed to find a way of growing productivity by 2.5% per annum. If we did that, we'd halve the gap in 15 years or so. We'd close it entirely in 30 years. So how about a target of catching the top tier by 2050? Perhaps it would nicely complement the carbon target the government's adopting. Think what a difference it would make for our kids and for their kids. Perhaps you think it's unrealistic. Well, on OECD numbers, the biggest countries in the OECD, the G7 countries, managed productivity growth in the last 15 years or so of 1.1% per annum. There were plenty of OECD countries, each in catch-up mode. This is Korea and Turkey and a number of the Eastern European countries that have matched or exceeded 2.5% annual productivity growth on average over 15 years. Mine's just a scenario, but it doesn't look like one that should be beyond New Zealand. And unlike any of those other countries, we were the richest and most productive country in the world barely a century ago. I could get more immediate and more concrete. In the last 5 or 6 years, New Zealand's productivity growth has been almost non-existent. Productivity in that time has increased by 1.5%. That's not per annum, that's in total over 5 years. Around a quarter of OECD countries have managed growth over that time of around 10%, 2% per annum. Yeah, what if we'd managed 10% productivity growth in 5 years? All else equal, the New Zealand economy this year would have been almost $25 billion bigger. $25 billion, what does that mean? It's almost $5,000 per person, $5,000 per man, per woman, per child. That's what we could have had if we just managed decent productivity growth in even the last 5 years. Now, you may have heard the headlines in the last year or two. When the wages data are released each quarter, voices are heard bemoaning the low rate of wage increases. Well, wages should be the main source of income in most households with children. The biggest single influence on the level of wages in the longer term is productivity. We've had virtually none of it. These are huge lost opportunities. Today's kids, the 3-year-old in 2013 who's an 8-year-old now, and their families, they bear the direct consequences of that failure in lower living standards, lower opportunities, including for us to redistribute. And who suffers most when economies underperform? Well, typically it's the least able, the least skilled, the people with the fewest connections, the fewest qualifications. Many professional people can always find a way out. Even if they can't, life here won't ever be too bad. But inequalities tend to widen in underperforming places because some have options and others don't. And for those at the bottom, and rightly or wrongly, the willingness of the rest of the population to provide support and to redistribute isn't limitless. So what might all this mean in practice? Well, higher productivity is about identifying smarter and better ways to do the stuff we always do, to find new products and services that can be developed or sold from here. But recall that in New Zealand we mostly aren't at what I call the frontiers. There are individual firms and sectors that might have internationally path-breaking technologies. But when your economy is so far behind that of the leaders, the biggest issue isn't really breaking totally new ground. It's great if it happens. It probably will for a few companies. But moving out towards the frontier itself is enough for us all to be a great deal better off. Recall, those top-tier countries have productivity levels 2/3 higher than those here. Now, productivity also isn't mostly about stuff governments actively do. Governments don't usually run leading-edge businesses. Governments didn't invent the steam engine or any of those other inventions and innovations that were critical to the Industrial Revolution, or indeed the new Industrial Revolution. Often enough, the biggest and best contribution that governments can make is to simply stop doing dumb stuff. I say simply, but of course often it's anything but, since almost every policy that is in place have people who believe in it fervently and perhaps vested interests who benefit from it directly. One of the obscure statistics I found a year or so ago was that at one stage we had 20 television factories in New Zealand. It's an incredible statistic. The reason we had 20 television factories in New Zealand is because of the belief at the time by the government that it should actively tilt the playing field to favour making things in little New Zealand, even when they could be produced far more cheaply abroad. And each television factory had its own vested interests. The more any particular beliefs reflects elite established opinion also, the harder it is to bring about change. And remember that elites can hold views that are just as wrong, just as reprehensible as any of the rest of us. Anyone for eugenics in its day. The print version of this, I've got a link to 7 beloved famous people who were keen on eugenics, thought it was a wonderful policy 100 years ago. Blind spots are real, vested interests are also real. Often when people talk about productivity or this or that country catching up, they highlight the real and big difference that having a market economy can make. Freedom can take you a long way, even the rather attenuated economic freedom they have in China, for example. But that isn't the issue that we face in New Zealand. We've scored well on indexes of economic freedom for a long time. So if that's not a helpful approach, what is? Well, one approach might be to say, well, if Belgium, France and the US are at the frontier, let's check out the policy frameworks in those countries. And that sort of approach did help us when I was young, when we took off the cocoon of protectionism, got inflation and the government accounts back under control in the 1980s. But it isn't an awful lot of use now. One particular study the OECD did a few years ago reckoned that if you compared their chosen subset of our policies with those of Belgium, we should be richer and more productive than them, not considerably poorer as we actually are. The people who did that study were obviously, almost by definition, focusing on the wrong variables. Not irrelevant ones, but just not ones that can explain how we're now so much off the pace, even further than we were 30 years ago. So where might we focus? Well, I'm not going to get into details here, but there are good ideas and, in my view, daft ideas out there. As an extreme example at the daft end is raising minimum wages as a solution to the productivity problem. Higher minimum wages may or may not be a good idea in the short term from a distributional perspective, but it isn't going to make any sort of contribution to solving our productivity failure. In fact, it inverts the logic. We're relatively rich because we live in a relatively productive economy, not because we legislate to pay each other a lot. I'm a bit sceptical of R&D tax credits too. The evidence globally that they work is thin, but more importantly, when your economy is so far away from the frontier, research-led innovation seems unlikely to be the most pressing issue. In my view, too many policy initiatives in the last 20 years have seemed to respond to scattered symptoms. People focus on this, that, or the other indicator, not on an in-depth understanding of why it is that we lag so badly. There are some ideas that might be part of the answer, but where I at least haven't been convinced. Fixing the over-regulated urban land market would fix the housing market, but some people reckon it would make a big difference to productivity as well. I'm sceptical, but as I've already touched on, reform in that area is vital and overdue anyway, so unjust are the housing and land outcomes. There are a few ideas that do seem promising to me. When I was a young economist in the Reserve Bank in the mid-80s, domestic experts, visiting overseas ones, recognised that one of the symptoms of New Zealand's failure up to then was an overvalued real exchange rate. It never really corrected then, and in the last 15 years, the real exchange rate has got even more out of line with our deteriorating relative productivity performance. I suspect we need to recover that 1984 insight. There are indicators in the market itself that suggest over time our exchange rate should be perhaps 30% lower than it is. As those same experts knew decades ago, one of the indicators of success for an economy is when firms operating here can sell a lot more stuff abroad, because abroad's a lot bigger market than home. In New Zealand, unlike the countries that are catching up, our exports and thus our imports have actually been shrinking as a share of GDP. I also think we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of not taxing too heavily stuff you want more of. Here I have in mind taxing capital income. There's a great deal of emphasis at the moment on tax fairness, but not that much on efficiency. We have one of the highest company tax rates in the advanced world and persistently low rates of business investment. And despite our poor productivity growth, despite being a haven of stability, strong government finances, no domestic financial crises and so on, we also have among the very highest real interest rates in the advanced world. And again, persistently low rates of business investment. Most new opportunities, most of the things that generate productivity gains, take concrete form through businesses investing. But these persistently high real interest rates, which incidentally have nothing to do with the Reserve Bank, don't seem to trouble any of our leaders. You just never hear them mentioned. And then there are issues around remoteness that I think need to be taken much more seriously. Too much analysis and policy debate in New Zealand seems implicitly to rest on North Atlantic comparators. The OECD is based in Paris. They see France, Belgium, Germany, Britain, or even East Asian ones. People constantly cite the example of Singapore. It's a wonderful achievement in many ways. But Singapore is in a location with hundreds of millions of people and vital shipping lanes in close proximity. By contrast, you'll know that New Zealand was the last major landmass settled by humans. It had no foreign trade at all for centuries after that. And certainly transport costs today are hugely lower than they once were, and we can all Skype. But strangely enough, in economics, distance and remoteness have become even more of an issue now than they were 100 years ago. I've argued that perhaps given our sustained underperformance, there's something more than a little strange about having one of the largest immigration programs anywhere in the world, putting ever more people in this most remote locations. But my point here isn't to give you the specific answers. That's a topic for another address in some other forum. Other people will have some other specific ideas. So what I'm calling for today is for politicians and the public, for key official agencies, the media, academics, to take the whole issue much more seriously again. Spend what it takes to get to the answers. Take the time it takes to get there and to winnow out the inevitable snake oil salesman, but treat it as a pressing national priority, because it's something the future of our kids and their kids depends on. This stuff really matters. Those 1913 comparisons I opened the talk with are supposed to remind you that if we and our kids are mostly so much better off today than my grandparents were as kids, it isn't mostly because of the redistributive efforts of successive governments, but because we've made so much more of what we had. It's the same for any big future improvements. Productivity is the possibilities. Fixing productivity isn't going to solve issues around family structure or family stability. It isn't going to fix pockets of attitudes and self-beliefs that can entrench bad outcomes. It isn't going to fix the housing debacle, but it would make a huge difference to the resources that society has available, including where that's the right thing to do, to redistribute through tax and public spending. It makes a real tangible difference. And I suspect one problem is that too many people have lost sight of just how real that is. Productivity is this abstract economist's word. Because New Zealand's fallen a long way behind, talking about lifting productivity here isn't just some airy-fairy fantasising about technologies that future generations might or might not have. We can get so far just by catching up again with places like the Netherlands or Denmark or France. We were number one, after all, for a long time. The worst of it is, from my perspective, is that from all appearances, our leaders, politicians particularly, but also bureaucrats, have largely given up, perhaps just idly hoping that something will turn up. And occasionally inserting higher productivity into a speech isn't evidence of serious intent. If anything, it seems more like a substitute. If we judge by the inaction of our leaders in tackling this persistent productivity failure, it suggests that when it comes to the crunch, ours, regardless of party, care much less about the kids of this generation and next than the rhetoric of election campaigns might suggest. Giving up on productivity, in practice and whatever the rhetoric, is a betrayal of our kids and their kids. Most especially, it betrays the children towards the bottom of the socio-economic scales, those who typically end up paying the most severe price of economic and social failure, here and everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was really interesting. So what I want to do now is just to open up the floor to some questions. So I'll firstly invite anyone that's got one. We've got a couple of hands going up there.
How much do you think the fact that we're a very long, thin country, sparsely populated, affects our productivity? For example, I've lived in small centres where just visiting the doctor was an hour's journey and an hour's journey back, and sometimes it meant a productive day was lost just going to the doctor.
I think sparsely populated probably isn't an issue. I mean, what the data show internationally is there's not much relationship, say, between the size of a country or the population density of the country and its economic success. Long, thin, mountainous country, yeah, sure, there are some costs. The costs they face in places like Norway, the costs they face in some places in the sort of middle of the US that are incredibly sparsely populated. I think there's enough variability there that even if it's a disadvantage, and maybe it's a permanent disadvantage, it might account for the last 1 or 2% of the difference between us and a small compact country like Belgium. It's not going to account for how when transport was even worse, we were the best in the world, and they were so far off the pace. Just as an example of your point, I was reading that 1913 yearbook. In 1913, coroners weren't even required to investigate deaths more than 20 miles from their home because it was just regarded as totally impossible to cover those distances. It's an issue, probably not a huge one.
I'm just thinking about, often when we see productivity increase recently, it's because of technology in the workplace. So if you bring in a lot of machines into a factory, you can generate higher outputs, except that in the process, most of the people lose their jobs. So does the increase of productivity filter throughout society, or does it tend to go to the business owners at the top?
Over time, I'm going to avoid the dreadful phrase trickle down, but over time, it spreads across the entire economy. You can look at whatever it is, the $20 smartphones they sell in the supermarkets that are available to everyone, and compare it to the sort of opportunities that were available a couple of hundred years ago to my ancestors thinking of moving here from the UK. You're right that transitions are disruptive to individuals' people's lives, but thinking about employment, we have a larger proportion of our population in employment now than we had 35 years ago, even with all that restructuring and all those sheltered and protected industries that we shook out. What we haven't succeeded in, so we've been able to continue to employ our workforce successfully. We have a pretty well-functioning labour market in that dimension in New Zealand. What we haven't seen is the levels of business investment that have enabled us to justify those higher wages and to close those gaps.
Hi, Michael. I was listening to a talk which is saying immigration in America has really increased productivity, and the immigrants in America are behind a lot of startups and entrepreneurship. I was just wondering your thoughts about immigration in relation to New Zealand and whether that's increasing productivity in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's a question that Wallace Chapman asked me the other day when I did the interview on this talk with Radio New Zealand. The one that people constantly cite is Silicon Valley, of course, and there's no doubt that immigrants have played a significant role there. I think the big challenge for us is that in the last 50 years, we've had far more immigration as a share of the population than the US has had, and we've had a really explicit skills focus in the way our immigration policy has been designed. So in the US, something like 2/3 of all their migrants are just family reunification people. So what it looks like, and despite all that immigration, our economic performance has been far worse than that of the US. So if immigration were an easy answer, it certainly doesn't look like it's one open to us. But you've also got to think about the incentives on people. Given that Silicon Valley's there, if you're a young, striving person in India or China or Latin America for that matter, where will you choose to go? Say you've got a choice of 5 Anglo countries, which are some of the most open markets in the world. Well, if you're that sort of entrepreneurial person, you'll try and get straight to the US, to Silicon Valley, because the opportunities are already there, the financing structures, the networks, and all those sorts of things that will build their business. If you can't get there, how about the UK? Silicon Fen, Cambridge, another really advanced technological sector. If you can't get there, Canada. If you can't get there, Australia. We're the end of the line. It's incredibly remote. If you're trying to build those entrepreneurial businesses, even those tech sector businesses, it's difficult to do so successfully here. And in fact, what we've found in New Zealand over the years is that we've got a lot of really smart and able people in New Zealand who have come up with good ideas, who start the businesses, and very quickly they find that those businesses are more valuable located closer to the major markets. Zero hasn't moved yet. My prediction is that within 5 years it probably will have. And it will just follow the path. And it's not irrational. It's very sensible from the perspective of those shareholders. When you look at New Zealand, 85% of our exports are still natural resource based, much the same in Australia. It doesn't look as if we need lots more people to take advantage of those natural resources. What we need is the ideas, the exchange rates, the tax systems, whatever. It's just this problem of being so incredibly remote in an age when distance and connections matter even more. So my argument is we should back our own really talented people. What the data show is that actually native-born New Zealanders have slightly higher skills than the average immigrant. The average immigrant has higher skills than the 65-year-olds who are retiring in New Zealand today, but so do the native New Zealanders, just educational standards have improved. We're not really adding to human capital. All we're doing is putting more people in one of the most unpropitious locations on earth.
What are your thoughts about measuring state sector productivity, in particular welfare as opposed to education and health?
To be honest, I don't have many thoughts on it. It's hard. As you're no doubt aware, the Productivity Commission has done a report relatively recently on that. Some friends of mine have been involved in it, but it's just not an issue I've looked at closely. I think there are separate issues there. There are measurement issues. Even if we could measure things more correctly, it wouldn't change the picture in total, because in the end we can see that wages in New Zealand are so much lower than wages in those top tier countries. In a sense, what the market can and will bear isn't consistent with being a top tier productivity country. So there might be some measurement issues. They might be quite important in some of those specific sectors, but it probably won't really shape this sort of conversation.
Thank you, Michael, for the speech. It's really interesting and thought-provoking. One of the questions that I have is around productivity, and what you mentioned, that it is about people being innovative and creating new ways and looking at new different ways of doing things. So New Zealand has actually been known as lots of people, number 8 wire, being different and approaching things differently. What do you think is the reason for that not translating into productivity?
Well, I mean, the bottom line of my story is that, and it's a very reductionist version of the story, is that we've just had too rapid a population growth that's basically been driven by immigration. The sign from our own New Zealanders is that the opportunities abroad are better. 1 million people have left. Continuing to grow the population in a country where the savings rate's not very high means that we have high interest rates by the rest of the world's standards and an exchange rate that's severely out of line. It means that it's not attractive for people to base businesses that can take on the rest of the world here. It's more attractive to, if you've got a good idea, to take it somewhere nearer the market, somewhere where the competitive conditions are better. So, I mean, you're quite right. I think there's nothing wrong with either the practical tinkering at the edges skills of New Zealanders, or indeed their willingness to take risks and start setting up new businesses. But it's just, we've made it a terrible location. Geography's against us, but when you do those sorts of things to the exchange rate and the interest rate, you just hobble yourself. Which is also why I'm optimistic that if we did change direction, maybe we couldn't match Belgium or France. We are still a long way away, but we could get an awful long way towards them.
Michael, you mentioned Productivity Commission. Are you aware of any other ongoing work and advice that they will be providing to the government? Or?
The Productivity Commission is basically responsible for doing investigations that the government asks them to do. They've got a limited amount of research capacity themselves. They published a paper about 18 months ago that I had a little bit of input into, actually, and it went some way towards identifying similar conclusions to the ones that I'm highlighting here. People there, I think, have become reasonably persuaded by my arguments around interest rates and the exchange rate, even raising questions about whether immigration has really been as good for New Zealanders as the elite view would say. But, you know, they are hamstrung a bit by the fact that deliberately it was set up in a way that says we want you to do the things we want you to do. And if it were different, the Productivity Commission itself would risk being wound up because it would become a thorn in government sides and they just end up defunding it. So,
I'm just wondering, from what you've said, it's hugely complicated to increase productivity. And I'm just wondering, if you were the Minister of Finance today and you had one policy that you could make to start the change, what would it be?
To cut the target level of non-citizen immigration to 10 to 15,000 per annum. We target 45,000 non-residents to get residence visas. That's 3 times per capita what they do in the United States. This is not Trump's United States. This is Bush, Obama, Clinton United States. It's 3 times what they do in the UK. Even the UK and Britain are larger than almost any other OECD country. The only other country that has more immigrants than we do is Israel. I've got a post on my blog this morning that shows that Israel's economy on the productivity front has done even worse than ours has over the last 35 years. It's not the whole answer, but you asked for one policy, that'd be mine.
A significant part of this economy is the small business sector. Awful lot of people out there risking money, employing 10 to 20 people on average. And if those people, having been in that sector and had quite a lot of exposure to it, you look to have a discussion with staff around productivity, you get often some spectacular lack of engagement. And you ask yourself, why does this happen? And I would go so far as to say there are issues around attitude, there are issues around, I like to come to work and then go home and get on with the rest of my life. You're risking your money, you've got all the wealth up there, there's not a distribution down where I'm happening. If you follow that on, you ask yourself, well, is there a lack of genuine self-improvement? Is there a lack of skills? But to my mind, there are some inhibitants going on at the bottom that are not stopping and lending themselves to an overall drive collectively towards productivity. And I'd just be interested in your view, what are the barriers, I guess, that you might see
Yeah,
there?
I mean, I'd be surprised if that was the big one. I mean, I suspect, I haven't seen the data, that if you go to small businesses in the United States or France or Belgium, you'll find that most people are interested in coming to work, getting an income, going home and doing the other stuff that matters to them in life. You know, there are personality differences between people who do take the risk and set up businesses and most of the rest of us. So I don't think that's the issue. And so I also don't think that the answer lies at the individual firm level, in the sense that individual firms can solve the problem. I mean, the issues that I'm pointing to are around the tax system, around housing, around the exchange rate, around interest rates, around immigration, are the big macro parameters that governments solve. I think if we saw material change there, we found the right package of measures, what you'd find is that the risk takers in New Zealand, of whom there are many, would respond and find those opportunities. And the workers, some of them would go with it enthusiastically, some would go grudgingly, just as they do now. The attitudinal issues, I suspect, are pretty common. You know, it would be surprising if attitudes of New Zealanders were much different than attitudes of workers in Australia or the UK. It's such a similar cultural background.
I have a slightly different... I don't think the macro settings are that bad. I mean, for doing business in New Zealand and risking some money and starting a business, I don't think the macro settings are inhibitant. I think there are other factors driving things here rather than those settings, in my view.
My challenge to that would be, I think, there's no doubt if you look at things like the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index and those sorts of things, the regulatory obstacles are small, generally. There's no doubt about that. And so that means that people who are in business now can often do quite well. But what we've ended up with is an economy that's very skewed towards looking inwards. Economists divide up the economy into what we call the tradable sector and the non-tradable sector, the bits that compete with the rest of the world and the bits that don't. There has been no growth per capita in the tradable sector of our economy for 20 years now. All the growth has been in that inward-looking, non-tradable sector. Individual businesses are doing stuff that's sensible for them, finding their way in that localised environment in the individual regulatory space. But it's that wider environment. Macro policy may be the wrong way for it. You know, we've got low and stable inflation. That's not a problem either. It's just the price signals people are getting around tax, real interest rates, real exchange rates, stuff you don't often think about because you just take it as a given, are creating the systemic problems for us.
I was just going to follow up from that question. You said earlier it's really important to have a shared national project. And I think one of the main issues, I think, is a lot of times the reasons people go to work and do business is actually just for selfish reasons. And if we had something that we were actually doing as New Zealand, maybe productivity might actually increase. I wonder if it's actually a psychological problem, like a persuasion problem.
I mean, there may be something at the margin there. It's hard to believe that with such similar cultures as, to say, again, Australia or the UK, that can be the main explanation for why we now lag so far behind when once we didn't. I mean, there is something, I think, of the having given upness, the fact that we have this exit option to Australia, and perhaps the only advantage if somehow the exit option to Australia were closed is that it might increase the focus here on saying if we want to improve opportunities, we have to do it for ourselves. We can't just take the plane to Sydney.
Well, first off, I just want to say I've bucked the trend. So I've just come back from Australia after living there for 5 years, so I'm the inflow again. So I think the tide is turning. But anyway, I want to really thank you all first for coming here today, and to you, Michael. I think there's been some really interesting outtakes from the session. The first thing for me was the demystification of what actually productivity is and what it could be. But then there were some quite shocking stats there, you know, like not least of which was, 40% lower than Australia, but 45 years off the pace. That's incredible. And, even in the last 5 years, only 1.5% compared to 10% of those top tiers, and that's over those 5 years. It's amazingly shocking to think of those stats. I think what you've done for us today has been very practical. It's been about translating and interpreting what it means and how it actually impacts on the lives of our tamariki, our children and our families, and I think that was really, really compelling. I'd like to thank you mostly for your generosity, for your thoughtfulness and for your openness in coming here and sharing your thoughts with us. I'd also like to, so I think we should do a big round of applause. I'd also like to thank again KPMG for making this available and possible for us. We really, really appreciate that. So again, we'll give you a round two. And then I'd like to thank all of you for taking your time out of your busy lives to come and share it with us this morning. We've enjoyed it, we've appreciated it, and you're more than welcome to stay longer if that works for you. I'd like to acknowledge some people in the team, so Susanna and Bronwyn and John, particularly for the work that you've done in making this a possibility, and for others in the teams supporting this to happen. So our next one is in a week or two, and so we invite you to just go and check it out on the website and sign up for it. So we're very excited about the series, and we've had some really good positive feedback about it. So thank you all. Have a great day. Again, thank you.